Jamaluddin says, I am a Muslim. I am devoted to my religion. I want to get it back from the state. And that is why I want a secular state. When young people come to religion, not because the state orders them, but because they feel it themselves in their hearts, it actually increases religious devotion. The Quran is a book to be interpreted by each age. Each epoch should not be tied to interpretations from 1,000 years ago. We should be open to interpretations based on new and changing times. On that hopeful note, I think I shall end. Thank you very much. I believe there will be time for questions this afternoon, so you'll have to be patient and keep your questions, attacks, whatever.
Vamos a hacer un turno de preguntas. Mientras venía para aquí, tiene que ponerse esta. No es verde. ¿Qué número? ¿El 2 para él?
The two, number 2.
¿Ahora me oye? ¿Ok?
Yeah.
¿Sí? Cuando venía para acá, estaba reflexionando. Este es un curso que se llama Democracia versus Teocracia. Es un curso donde se contraponen dos maneras de pensar, la razón y el pensamiento crítico en frente de la teología, lo que nos llega por la revelación. Y resulta que este es un curso donde hay 4 personas que van con escoltas. O sea, aquí tenemos a usted que viene con protección policial, tenemos al señor Robert Rede que también viene con ella, y hemos tenido ayer a 2 personas, una llegó ya con su escolta porque es una persona crítica con el movimiento separatista vasco, los terroristas vascos de ETA, y Antonio Lorza también en su universidad también está protegido por la policía. ¿Qué le parece a usted que en este siglo XXI estemos dando un curso con 4 personas controladas, vigiladas, cuidadas por la policía? ¿Qué?
You're asking me now? Oh. Yes, no, this is... we have noticed ever since the Rushdie affair, in fact it was the Rushdie affair which pushed me to write my first book, which came out in 1995, although I wrote most of it in 1993. At the time of the Rushdie affair, Western intellectuals, with a few noble exceptions, tended to blame the victim, that's to say Rushdie. They criticized Rushdie for offending Muslim sensibilities. And those who should have been defending Rushdie's right to freedom of expression were instead attacking him. Eventually, a movement did build up, I'm glad to say, which defended Rushdie's right to freedom of expression. But there were an incredible number of distinguished intellectuals who did not take Rushdie's side. And we notice the same things happening in the West now, starting with the controversy over the Danish cartoons, followed by the controversy over the film by Geert Wilders, Fitna. Instead of protecting its citizens who are simply using their freedom of expression, the governments are even taking them to court. They're threatening people like Wilders with court action. They should be celebrated as heroes, as not prosecuted. They have not broken any law in the West. Unfortunately, under pressure from Islamic governments and undemocratic institutions like the European Parliament, they're pushing through laws which will now make it more and more difficult to criticize Islam. They have noble intentions, I'm sure, to stop racism, not to offend unnecessarily, and so on. But this has led to the stifling of critical look at Islam, particularly. So the fact that we are now faced with intellectuals having to have police protection is appalling. It is an extraordinary state that we in the West should be needing protection for exercising our freedom of expression. It is a lamentable situation. These people should be given wholehearted, complete, noisy support, not condemned or, oh, he should have known better, or the usual arguments like with freedom of expression comes responsibility, and we must. And what is this right not to be offended? There's no such right as not to be offended. I mean, I'm offended by the Quran, for heaven's sake. So, I mean, why are the sensibilities of the Muslims more important than anybody else's sensibilities, in any case? So, yes, I agree. It's just this appalling situation.
Perdona, ¿cómo podemos hacer las preguntas del público? ¿Vienen aquí a mi micrófono? Ah, no, tienes aquí. Ah, vale, vale. ¿Tú quieres?
Oh, you want questions now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
This lady.
Gracias por estar aquí, es un privilegio creo para todos el poder escucharle y para mí es emocionante, particularmente emocionante porque
no te oye la traductora.
¿No?
¿Ahora?
¿No? ¿Ahora? A ver, espera.
¿Cómo la arreglamos?
Ahora.
Sí, ahora. ¿Sí? Gracias, perdón. Le decía que...
Más cerca, más cerca.
¿Más cerca ahora?
No, sepárate.
¿Ahora? Interesante poco. ¿Ya? Le decía que gracias por estar aquí, es particularmente emocionante. Voy a personalizar un poco, discúlpeme. Usted defiende unos derechos que muchas personas defendemos también en nuestro país. Cuando yo leía, mi compañera traía su libro y estaba observando una referencia que dice...
Perdona, intentar hablar de eso.
¿Qué hago?
Sí, pues ponte aquí.
Sí. Perdón.
Sí,
No, perdón, el sistema.
Mi compañera...
Que apaguen los micrófonos de la mesa.
Si apagan los micrófonos.
Vale, vale, apago el micrófono. Ahora con el otro.
El otro también, porque le llega el eco de...
¿Cuál es?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Ahora sí. Bien.
Luego se enciende el otro, se apaga este y ya está.
¿Ahora sí?
Yo intentaba comentarle que leyendo esto yo estaba también reflexionando. Una llamada valiente a defender la libertad de expresión y a proteger los derechos humanos, especialmente los de las mujeres. Estamos en un momento en que la libertad de las mujeres y los derechos de ellas en nuestro país, yo no sé si tiene connotaciones islámicas o no, pero se están vulnerando exactamente igual. Esta madrugada, por no tener la escolta adecuada, una señora con orden de alejamiento la han vuelto a matar. Esto está ocurriendo aquí cada día. Yo pienso, y recordaba, oyéndola hablar a usted, a Oriana Falachi, un maravilloso artículo que hizo sobre el Islam, en el que decía que nos querían imponer el burka a todos, pero el burka mental para taparnos el alma, nuestra creencia y nuestra forma de expresión y nuestra forma de vida. yo he creído oír que no pueden existir dos religiones en el mismo país. Entendía que resurge la esclavitud, volví a hablar de las lapidaciones a mujeres, que hay dos leyes islamistas. Ante todo esto, ¿qué tenemos que hacer? Volver a las dos religiones que han periódicamente, cíclicamente, han interpuesto una ley, un derecho por encima de otro. ¿Cuál es la solución? Sabemos cuáles son los problemas. No queremos tenerla aquí con escoltas, ni queremos que hayan personas que no puedan defender su libertad. Pero ante tanto pesimismo, alguna connotación positiva tiene que haber. Ayer un señor en esta mesa explicaba de una forma bondadosa y generosa que había que acercar una cultura a otra, una religión a otra. Yo le pido un pensamiento positivo y una posible solución ante todo esto que es real y cierto, si lo hay. Gracias.
Okay, first of all, the situation, even in the West, is quite dramatic. For example, there has been a resurgence of honor killings in the West, and in the last 5 years I've been invited to various conferences. The first one in 2003 in Stockholm, where the police, the Swedish police, are so politically correct, not wishing to criticize any Islamic practice, have tended to send back girls who are running away from their families because these girls were fearing the punishments from their families for adopting Western ways. The police have not taken their fears seriously, and they've often returned these girls to their families with tragic results. And this is continuing. In Britain, this has happened on several occasions, in the United States. So we need to highlight these cases and ask for some kind of justice. We must point out them. But amazingly enough, the newspapers like the New York Times refuses to even report the cases of, for example, there's two girls who were killed by their father in Texas for being too Western. So we can highlight these cases. Again, as far as stoning to death is a practice which has re-emerged in Iran. Again, if we take up the cause and make Amnesty International, for example, defend this case, and if we highlight it and make it a media event, get various intellectuals backing it, you will be amazed at the results. I know that the humanist movement has often has intervened and saved the lives of several women. Well, the humanists were instrumental in getting Taslima Nasreen, a Bengali woman, out of Bangladesh because of pressure from the Western governments, because she was under attack. She had to go into hiding because she was defending the rights of Hindus and of women generally. As soon as these events are taken note of by the Western press, the Iranian government does tend to take note, but it won't work each time. But again, there is an incredible reluctance on the part of Western feminists to criticize such practices in Islamic countries. There's a total contradiction with all that they've been fighting for since the 1960s. And so you get very prominent feminists of the 60s and 70s, like Germaine Greer, who refuses to condemn such practices. So we need to be consistent. We must get the Western feminists should really take a leading role in this. We can also pressure the government at the government level, and also since Iran is theoretically a signatory to the United Nations covenants on religious toleration and so on, and they theoretically have agreed to all the articles of the 1948 Declaration, we should point out that this goes against several articles in the 1948 Declaration to stone up a person to death. I think that's I hope some kind of an answer.
Eva.
Muchas gracias. Sí. Bueno, yo quería hacer... buenos días. Yo quería hacer dos preguntas. Una es relativa a la formación de estudiantes universitarios procedentes de estados islámicos en Occidente. Y luego, por otro lado, la repercusión de la falta de estudiantes occidentales en países islámicos. De manera, este desequilibrio, ¿de qué forma favorece a la sociedad islámica? Ayer Antonio Lorza comentaba que prácticamente no tenemos islamólogos aquí en España. ¿Cómo ve usted esta situación y cómo puede afectar al conjunto del futuro del conocimiento de los estudiantes islámicos, el hecho de estar en universidades occidentales y empaparse de lo que es la cultura occidental, con lo cual un gran conocimiento para ellos, que nosotros no tenemos? Gracias.
Yes, unfortunately, until very recently, soon after 9/11 in 2001, there were a spate of popular books on Islam, but unfortunately these were written by apologists of Islam who refused to discuss issues such as stoning to death of women, the inferior status of women under Islam. Instead, they pretended that something called the real Islam was really feminist, that the real Islam was for peace, and the real Islam, there was no such thing as jihad, and so on. And it was independent scholars, even non-specialists like me, if you like. I'm not really a specialist in that sense, who had the courage to pick up a Quran and apply some critical thought. We should be suspicious of these specialists because they've been apologizing for Islam for a very long time. You really don't need any specialist knowledge. You need a Quran translated by a Muslim. I don't know what the situation is in Spanish, but in English there are several Qurans translated into English by Muslims. You need to get several of those, and you can get most of the hadith, which are the traditions, in English. Again, I don't know what the situation is in Spanish. And there is the oldest extant biography of the Prophet in Arabic, which has also been translated into English. And that's all you need. Then you can read for yourself that you have been told lies by these popularizers or even by specialists. And again, there are now several books which have been very critical of Islam, which are nonetheless well documented, very well documented. And finally, people are no longer listening to nonsense from the apologists, like Karen Armstrong, for example. She's the most notorious apologist of Islam. So we can educate. Indeed, the Muslim students, the Islamic students in the West, in principles of democracy, for example, we can try to defend our own values, Western values, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and why we have a separation of church and state, and the long history for the struggle for freedom, generally in the West. These things are not taught. Instead, we are taught by our intellectuals how horrible we all are. And why should an immigrant from, as the black American writer James Baldwin once put it, why should we want to integrate into a sinking ship? Unless we start taking a pride in our values, and unless we defend these values, we will not be in a position to defend, to teach the Islamic students on the principles of democracy and liberalism and constitutional liberalism and so on. Okay.
Silvia.
Sí, yo quería preguntarle qué opinión le merece el concepto islamismo moderado, porque aquí en Europa se nos suele mostrar, por ejemplo, el gobierno de Turquía o las declaraciones de Tariq Ramadan como de islamismo moderado, como una posibilidad de que haya alguna variante del Islam que pueda ser compatible con Occidente. ¿Qué opinión le merece?
I'm very, very skeptical of the whole notion of moderate Islam. There's an old joke which says, what is the difference between a moderate Islamist in Iran and an Islamist? Well, the moderate Islamist is the one who has run out of ammunition. So, certainly there are, but not the ones that are in the news. I would not call Tariq Ramadan a moderate Muslim. He is very adept at disguising his real views, but if you read carefully his statements, he says one thing to his Arabic-speaking audiences and something totally different to the Western audiences. He's evasive, completely, utterly evasive on substantive issues. If you ask him, what does he think about stoning to death for adultery? He won't say, no, I condemn it completely. He will say, well, we should have a moratorium on it. That's to say, stop for the moment. He doesn't condemn it. He said, well, we should think about it. It's no outright condemnation, and this is his way of avoiding any difficult questions. He's always equivocates. So who are the true moderates? Well, it's very, very difficult. I'll give you one example there. Each time the West suddenly decides to pick on one particular writer as the great big hope for the moderate Islamic world, in the West that is, if you read carefully what they do, what they say afterwards, you realize that they've been mistaken, that the West has been mistaken. They take a writer who was championed as a great hope, as a great moderate, called Reza Aslan. He wrote a book about 3 years ago, I've forgotten the title now, I forget what the title was, Reza Aslan. Okay. I don't know if you know the writer Sam Harris. He wrote a book called The End of Faith. He is a good friend of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's. He's a great critic of Islam, who's an apostate and an atheist. She moved from Holland, where she was a member of parliament, to the United States. And the Dutch government refused to continue to protect her in the United States. So Sam Harris decided to form a committee to raise money for her protection. And the first person, one of the first persons he wrote to was supposedly this great big moderate Muslim, Reza Aslan. Reza Aslan wrote back a most nasty letter attacking Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Refused to help in any way. It was an intemperate, vicious attack. So there are all sorts of courageous individuals in the Islamic world who are fighting for human rights, and it's much more difficult for them. It's okay for me. I write under a pseudonym, and I'm comparatively freed, even though I need protection now and then. You have, for example, a recent columnist in Kuwait was asking for a secular state. She said that the only way that both the Sunnis and the Shias can have full religious freedom is to have a secular state which is neutral. Then there is a human rights lawyer in Pakistan called Asma Jahangir, incredibly courageous woman who never actually attacks Islam full face, full frontally. She simply defends women against the divorce law. She defends the rights of women in courts of law, in housing, in settlements after divorce, and so on. And case after case, she has defended the rights of women. So there are all sorts of individuals in the Islamic world, but unfortunately, the West, especially the media, don't want to know about them. They take the attitude of Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is the French intellectual who, at the time of Khomeini, was an enthusiastic supporter of the Khomeini revolution. And when a group of secular Iranians criticized him for supporting the barbaric regime, he said, who are you? You're totally inauthentic. For Foucault and for many intellectuals and the media in general now, anybody who takes a position from the point of view of human rights, it's considered not truly Islamic, truly authentic. So we can disregard them. So instead of supporting human rights activists like Asma Jahangir and this journalist I was talking about in Kuwait, they tend to pick on so-called moderates like Tariq Ramadan in the West. So it's very disappointing. Again, we could do so much more by supporting these. There's another Egyptian scholar, human rights activist called Tariq Hegi. Amazing. He's called the human rights one of the greatest creations of the human mind. And this is in an Egyptian context. He said it in Egypt, in Arabic, and again he was criticized and his life was threatened, but he's still there and he's still championing human rights. So we need to highlight their cases, we need to defend them. Some of them are taken to court for criticizing Islam. And yet we don't do that, because the Western papers, Western intellectuals, doesn't consider them truly, authentically Islamic somehow. Okay.
Juan Antonio. Yes. Juan Antonio.
Buenos días. Han estado comentando sobre los estudiantes de países musulmanes que vienen a Europa y sobre los pocos europeos que van a quedar a países musulmanes. Han comentado cómo se supone que Occidente debe apoyar al Islam moderado para intentar que haya una especie de reforma, pero en la práctica todo eso no se aplica. Por ejemplo, lo que tampoco se ve por los medios es el periplo de varios chicos estudiantes musulmanes que han estado viajando por Europa intentando que alguna administración les concediera asilo político para no tener que volver a su país y ser torturados y asesinados. Entonces, lo que al final se ha conseguido que la Unión Europea fijara un mínimo que obligaba a los países miembros a ofrecer asilo político si la vuelta a tu país de origen conlleva tortura. Entonces, lo que yo, para conseguir eso se ha necesitado una presión tremenda de parte, sobre todo, de radicales italianos. Entonces, lo que me quería preguntarle es que, aparte de esa medida de presión popular, ¿qué se puede hacer para presionar internacionalmente? Quiero decir, ¿no va siendo hora de dejar de reconocer como interlocutores a quienes por idea no lo son?
I think so, yes. So, what can we do to protect? I'm not entirely certain of the question.
He says that perhaps the solution is not to pay that credit to these people, Tariq Ramadan and people like this.
No, I agree. No, we shouldn't listen to so-called moderates like he's not a real moderate like Tariq Ramadan. I absolutely agree. We should be unequivocally helping those seeking asylum and to really trying, because their lives would be in danger if they went back. Absolutely, you're right. Yes, this was the tenor of my reply to this lady earlier. Absolutely, I agree with you entirely. We've been led astray by this search for some mythical beast called the moderate Muslim. So we should know who the true moderates are. Yeah. Talking about two cases. One was a French scholar of the slave trade with an unpronounceable name, Grenouille. Is that à peu près? I, in fact, discuss the work of this French scholar on the history of the slave trade in my new book called Defending the West. I have a very long section on slavery because the French scholar shows that in terms of sheer volume that the Arabs were responsible for more displacements of black Africans from their homelands to various countries in the Islamic world, and their treatment was often more horrible because it also involved castration, because many of these were black Africans were captured very young and castrated so that they could work in the harems in the Middle East. This is something which is not ever discussed, And as the gentleman said, when this French scholar wrote his book, he was criticized. There was a possibility of even being prosecuted for completely and thoroughly scholarly work with impeccable research and into archives, into not just secondary literature but primary literature. So it was an amazing work of scholarship. And yet, because he talked about the slave trade as conducted by Arabs, he was attacked in the court of law. It's amazing, it's extraordinary. Anyway, it is an incredible work that I agree with. More recently, there's a book by a man called Sylvain Guggenheim. I actually met him very briefly last March, who's written a book showing that, contrary to popular ideas, we owe perhaps less to the transmission of Greek knowledge to the Arabs. Supposedly, the traditional picture is that supposedly during the Middle Age, Dark Ages in Europe, the Arab world, the Islamic world, preserved many works of Greek literature and science which would have been lost if they had not preserved it and then passed it on to Europe. Guggenheim tries to show that this was not entirely an accurate picture. And again, his work is work of a scholar, impeccably documented, and he has been attacked in the press. A group of scholars have got round, are in fact petitioning for him to be thrown out of his university post. This is incredible. There's no discussion of his thesis. This is a blanket condemnation, threatened with action, legal action. There's no discussion of the work. Unfortunately, in the French context, this has been made more difficult, and I think it was a very dangerous trend in my view, when the French government passed a law which forbade denying, you cannot deny legally the Holocaust, which is, we all know, or any rational person knows that the Holocaust took place. We just know it. But do we need a law to tell us that? This is a very bad precedent. I mean, I can soon see a situation where, under pressure from Islamic countries, we will have a law actually forbidding us to say that Muhammad was married to a 9-year-old girl. The whole situation can backfire. I think it's very dangerous. I think we should have absolute freedom of expression, and we should refute scholars like this British historian called Irving, who tries to deny or at least minimize the Holocaust. We should refute them with arguments, with books, evidence, not by law. You cannot have history by law. Okay.
Vamos a dar la última palabra porque ya se está haciendo un poco tarde. A Sandalio.
Bueno, yo quería hacer una pregunta un poquito circunscrita al Estado español, que dadas las circunstancias que últimamente estamos observando. Para hacer un breve resumen, el Partido Socialista está incluyendo desde hace varias legislaturas personas musulmanas en sus listas, y básicamente lo hace por miedo para evitar la creación de un partido socialista. Con la obtención de la nacionalidad española de muchos musulmanes en estos últimos años, y con la ley electoral española podría perfectamente obtener representación parlamentaria si este partido se crease y se presentara a las elecciones. Yo quería preguntarle su opinión sobre la repercusión que esto podría tener sobre los derechos individuales de las personas, de los españoles.
I'm not sure I followed the details. Would the party, they would be...
He says that it can be dangerous for the Spanish democracy, the concretion of the Muslim party in Spain.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it would indeed be incredibly dangerous if what they based their platform on was the introduction of more and more Sharia into the West. Definitely, we mustn't allow that. They must still, they can call themselves Muslims, but they must obey Spanish laws. There must be absolute no concession to Islamic law. There must be equality before the law. We've been fighting for centuries to have equality before the law. We cannot possibly give in now. There must be no concession whatsoever to any aspect of Sharia. They can campaign for the rights of immigrants or whatever, but as long as it is within the laws of the country, which are secular, right?
Okay.
No, I agree. I think it's very dangerous, and in fact, something I was talking to a man called Alan Johnson, who's a founder of a website which has become very influential in Britain called Democratia. I think it's democratia.org, and he was saying that the British government has also, in order to woo Muslim voters, and in the mistaken belief that they can perhaps integrate them better, has encouraged various strands of Islamic candidates, which has encouraged the creation of Islamic structures. They've been going around the country giving these talks, but in so doing they're helping to spread a structure which is going to have terrible consequences in the long run. I think it's very dangerous, yes, I think, but we must not give in, we must not concede a single point to Sharia.
Okay, thank you very much. Bueno, pues despedimos al señor Ibn Waraq hasta la mesa redonda de la tarde y le damos las gracias por sus reveladoras